What the vast majority of people observed unfolding this past week was nothing more than yet another characteristic Trump tantrum that, through some inexplicable twist of fate, concluded with financial markets soaring to new heights and European allies collectively breathing a sigh of relief. However, what they failed to see beneath the surface was the single most significant constitutional crisis in NATO's entire 77-year history, a crisis that was quietly and effectively resolved through a complex diplomatic maneuver that virtually no one fully comprehends even now. Yet, the sheer speed of this dramatic reversal should serve as an alarm bell to anyone who truly understands the intricate mechanics of how alliance politics actually function in the real world. I am Richard Conway, and my purpose here is to reveal what remains hidden from the casual observer, to expose what others refuse to hear, and to analyze the potent but invisible forces that no one else seems to recognize or anticipate. Today, it is absolutely imperative that we dissect precisely what transpired inside that private meeting room in Davos between President Trump and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, because this so-called framework of a future deal is definitively not what anyone thinks it is. Here is the narrative that the general public has been led to believe. Trump arrived in Davos making seemingly impossible demands regarding the acquisition of Greenland and threatening 8 key NATO allies with rapidly escalating tariffs. Then, after a single high-stakes meeting with Rutte, he suddenly announced the existence of a mysterious framework agreement and unilaterally canceled all the threatened tariffs. Markets celebrated the news, European leaders claimed a significant victory, and everyone moved on with their lives, assuming that cooler heads had simply prevailed in the end. The financial press treated this development as yet another example of Trump's supposed deal-making genius, while European media portrayed it as a successful instance of resistance against American overreach. That prevailing narrative is undeniably comfortable because it suggests that the system worked exactly as intended. It implies that institutional diplomacy successfully triumphed over impulsive, personality-driven politics. But when you examine closely what actually transpired behind closed doors, the reality is far more complex and considerably more revealing about how power truly operates within the Atlantic Alliance today. The framework agreement represents something entirely unprecedented in the history of NATO, a formal, if unwritten, mechanism for containing disruptive behavior by the alliance's single dominant member. Let me start by outlining what we know for absolute certain. On Saturday, Trump announced 10% tariffs on Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland. He further threatened that these would escalate to 25% by June unless the United States gained complete and total purchase of Greenland. This wasn't a negotiation in any traditional sense. It was extortion directed squarely at America's closest military allies. The targeted countries represent nearly 40% of global GDP and include 3 nuclear powers. European officials responded with a level of unprecedented unity that caught Washington completely off guard. Emergency EU meetings were hastily scheduled for Sunday, and joint statements were issued condemning the threats as fundamentally incompatible with alliance membership. Several governments explicitly and publicly stated that they would not be blackmailed. France's Emmanuel Macron declared unequivocally that no intimidation nor threat will influence us. Sweden's Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson announced coordinated response discussions, marking the first time in NATO history that the alliance's core members were openly discussing whether their security guarantees extended to defending against the dominant member itself. The institutional mechanics of this resistance reveal something crucial about the state of contemporary alliance politics. Rather than responding through bilateral channels as might have been expected in the past, European capitals immediately coordinated their actions through existing EU and NATO frameworks. This wasn't accidental. It demonstrated that decades of institutional development had created automatic responses to internal threats that effectively bypassed traditional American gatekeeping mechanisms. Then came Davos. Trump's speech on Wednesday morning seemed to double down on confrontation. He demanded immediate negotiations for Greenland ownership and argued that only the United States possessed the capacity to defend the territory. But he also made one crucial concession that most observers missed entirely. He explicitly ruled out the use of military force, saying he won't do that, despite asserting that America would be unstoppable if he chose that path. The audience reaction was notably cool, marked by polite applause rather than the enthusiastic response Trump typically expects and thrives upon. That statement wasn't mere bluster, it was effectively a surrender. By removing the military option from his toolkit, Trump had effectively acknowledged that NATO's Article 5 collective defense guarantee created an impossible strategic bind for him. Any military move against Greenland would trigger the alliance's mutual defense clause, potentially putting American forces at war with American allies. This constitutional impossibility had been the Europeans' trump card all along, though remarkably few analysts recognized it at the time. This is where the framework becomes critically important, not for what it promises, but for what it prevents. Rutte didn't negotiate a deal for American control of Greenland. He negotiated Trump out of a position that threatened to destroy the institutional foundation of Western security. The framework isn't about Greenland at all. It is fundamentally about NATO's survival as a functioning alliance. What Rutte offered Trump was a dignified exit from an untenable position, disguised as a strategic breakthrough. Consider carefully what Rutte actually said about their meeting. When asked directly whether Danish sovereignty over Greenland would continue under the framework, he replied that the issue did not come up. NATO spokeswoman Alison Hart confirmed that Rutte did not propose any compromise to sovereignty and that discussions focused entirely on collective efforts for Arctic security. These are not the statements of officials who just negotiated a territorial transfer. They are the careful, measured words of diplomats, protecting both sides from admitting the obvious. What they describe instead is a face-saving mechanism designed with surgical precision. Trump gets to claim he secured American interests in Greenland without admitting he abandoned his stated objective. European allies get to maintain sovereignty while providing enhanced cooperation on Arctic defense that they were already planning to implement anyway. NATO gets to survive its first internal existential crisis without fracturing. Everyone wins by agreeing to pretend that something substantial happened when, in fact, nothing fundamental changed. The strategic genius of this approach lies in its deliberate ambiguity. By keeping the framework's details classified indefinitely, both sides can declare victory to their domestic audiences, while avoiding the specifics that might expose the compromises each made. Trump can tell his supporters he got everything we wanted, while European leaders can assure their publics that sovereignty remains intact. The ambiguity isn't a bug in the system, it's the entire purpose. But ambiguity in international relations is never neutral. It favors whoever has less to lose from ongoing uncertainty. In this case, that's clearly the European allies, not the United States. By accepting a vague framework instead of concrete concessions, Trump essentially acknowledged that his leverage was insufficient to force the outcomes he demanded. This represents a fundamental shift in transatlantic power dynamics that most commentators have completely missed. This matters for several reasons that extend far beyond Arctic territorial disputes. First, it establishes a precedent that NATO members will collectively resist economic coercion from within the alliance. The joint European response to Trump's tariff threats demonstrated institutional resilience that many observers had questioned. When faced with unprecedented internal pressure, the alliance held together rather than fragmenting into bilateral negotiations that would have favored American power advantages. Second, it reveals the limits of unilateral economic power in a deeply integrated system where retaliation mechanisms have been carefully constructed over decades. Trump's tariff threats created immediate market volatility and diplomatic tension, but they also triggered automatic mechanisms designed to contain exactly this kind of disruption. European unity, congressional criticism from both parties, and business community pressure combined to make the threats unsustainable regardless of their short-term effectiveness. Third, it signals a fundamental shift in how American allies approach relationship management with Washington under conditions of institutional stress. Rather than accommodating unreasonable demands to preserve stability, they chose confrontation followed by negotiated ambiguity. This represents a more sophisticated understanding of how to manage an unpredictable partner without surrendering core interests. The Europeans essentially called Trump's bluff and won. The market response to Wednesday's framework announcement tells its own story about how financial institutions interpret geopolitical risk. Stocks didn't rise because investors believed America had gained control of Greenland. They rose because a source of systematic risk had been contained without anyone having to admit they'd backed down. Financial markets don't reward territorial expansion. They reward predictability and the removal of threats to established systems that undergird global trade flows. For NATO as an institution, this crisis may prove strengthening in the long term despite its apparent dangers. The alliance survived its first serious internal challenge not through American dominance or European submission, but through collective resistance followed by diplomatic compromise. That's exactly how successful institutions manage existential pressures without abandoning their foundational principles. The precedent now exists for containing disruptive member behavior through coordinated institutional response. Trump's behavior throughout this episode reveals something important about the difference between tactical leverage and strategic power in contemporary international relations. He possessed significant tactical advantages through his tariff authority and presidential platform, but strategic power requires sustainable positions that other actors cannot effectively counter. When 8 NATO allies responded with unified resistance backed by institutional legitimacy and mutual economic dependencies, Trump's tactical leverage became a strategic liability. This dynamic helps explain why the framework had to remain deliberately vague rather than specifying concrete commitments from either side. Specific commitments would have required Trump to acknowledge the limits of his demands or European allies to accept unpalatable concessions that their publics would reject. Ambiguity allows both sides to avoid those choices while establishing new parameters for future interactions based on demonstrated capabilities rather than stated intentions. The constitutional implications extend far beyond Greenland or even Arctic security arrangements. For 77 years, NATO has operated on the assumption that external threats would test alliance solidarity, while internal disputes could be managed through established diplomatic channels. This crisis demonstrated that internal threats can be equally destabilizing but require different management approaches that existing frameworks weren't designed to handle. The framework essentially creates new, informal protocols for containing disruptive behavior by alliance members, without fracturing the broader security architecture. These protocols rely on coordinated economic and diplomatic pressure rather than formal sanctions or institutional expulsion procedures that don't exist in NATO's founding charter. It is crisis management through improvisation rather than established procedure. What concerns me most about this resolution is not what it achieved, but what it normalized for future alliance interactions. The precedent now exists for American presidents to threaten military allies with economic coercion as standard diplomatic practice. The fact that such threats can be walked back through vague framework agreements doesn't eliminate their corrosive effect on alliance trust and institutional credibility. European allies learned this week that they cannot rely on American restraint or institutional norms to constrain presidential behavior that contradicts alliance principles. They can only rely on their own collective capacity to impose costs that make such behavior unsustainable. That's a more realistic foundation for alliance management, but it's also a more fragile one that requires constant, active maintenance. Looking forward, the Greenland framework will likely become a template for managing similar crises rather than preventing them from occurring. The pattern is now established. Unreasonable demands, allied resistance, market pressure, and negotiated ambiguity that allows all parties to claim success while avoiding concrete commitments. This may preserve institutional stability, but it does so by institutionalizing instability as a normal feature of alliance politics. The broader lesson here is about the evolution of American power within the Western alliance system during an era of increasing multipolarity. The United States can no longer assume that size and security guarantees automatically translate into deference on unrelated issues. Allies have learned to compartmentalize security cooperation from other forms of pressure, making them more resilient partners but also less accommodating ones when their core interests are threatened. Trump's Greenland gambit ultimately failed not because his demands were unreasonable, though they certainly were, but because he misunderstood the nature of institutional power in a multipolar system where smaller actors can coordinate. Resistance. Coercion works when the target has no alternatives. When 8 NATO allies can coordinate resistance and impose economic and political costs for disruptive behavior, coercion becomes counterproductive regardless of the coercer's nominal power advantages. This framework agreement matters less for what it says about Greenland than for what it reveals about the changing dynamics of alliance management in an era of internal pressures and institutional stress. The resolution preserved NATO's institutional integrity, but it also demonstrated that such preservation now requires constant active defense rather than passive maintenance. That's a more demanding standard for alliance leadership, but probably a more realistic one given contemporary political realities.